Good afternoon, everyone. We will begin our webinar shortly. We want to give a few more minutes for participants to join. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the Illinois Power Hour webinars. Thank you for finding time to attend the IPA Power Hour webinar on expansion of the Illinois RPS under CEJA. My name is Megha Hamal and I am the Communications Manager at the Illinois Power Agency. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded. A recorded version of this session will be available on the IPA website, along with the PDF of the presentation slides sometime this afternoon. To reduce any background noise, all participants are muted upon entry. We have also enabled live transcript for the meeting today. If you wish to hide the live transcript, you may click on the live transcript button on your Zoom bar at the bottom of your screen and then click Hide Subtitle. Please feel free to ask questions at any time during the webinar. We will reserve some time towards the end of the presentation to address these questions. To submit questions, please use the chat feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. In today's webinar, we will be covering introduction and scope of the IPA Power Hour webinars, background on the recently enacted Public Act 102-0662, background on the Renewable Portfolio Standard, overview of the Renewable Portfolio Standard and its changes, and RPS specifics. And with that, I would now like to introduce you to our presenters. Our presenters for today's session are Anthony Starr, Director, Illinois Power Agency, Brian Granahan, Chief Legal Counsel, Illinois Power Agency. Thank you both for taking the time out of your busy schedules to present at this session. With that, Anthony, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Megha, and thank you everybody for attending today's first Power Hour webinar. I really appreciate everyone taking their time to learn more about the Illinois Power Agency's work and the expansion of the Illinois RPS under the Clean and Equitable Jobs Act. Okay, next slide, please. So Megha went through the agenda already, so I think I want to spend a few minutes at the beginning talking a little bit about the Power Hour webinars. This is a new initiative of the IPA. Then we'll go do some background on how we got to where we are today with this exciting new legislation. Step back a little bit, talk about renewable portfolio standards more generally, and then go into some of the specific changes to the renewable portfolio standard and some of the specifics. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the Power Hour is a newly launched series of for the IPA. This is an opportunity for us to do educational and informative presentations as a way. In the past, we've often done stakeholder workshops where we really want to dive into issues and get feedback. This is an opportunity for the IPA to provide information and education out to the general public on the things that we're doing. And this is the first of a series we're going to be having. We will be posting the recording of today's webinar and there's PowerPoint slides to our website. So if you know people who you think the information we're presenting today or future sessions is useful, please send them to our website to learn. We hope that this becomes sort of a body of knowledge that can be helpful to all the wide and diverse stakeholders working in the renewable energy sector in Illinois. This is also part of a more general initiative we've been having at the IPA to sort of expand the ways in which we communicate with various stakeholders. We recently launched a quarterly newsletter. You can subscribe to that by going to our website on the Contact Us tab. There is a subscription option, a place to sign up to receive that newsletter. So again, this is part of, I think, a shift in the IPA as we've expanded as an agency and as the scope of the work that we do expands as well, to really make sure that we do a better job in terms of making sure that everyone knows what we're doing and what the key issues are and can learn from all that. Today, we're going to focus specifically on the Clean and Equitable Jobs Act and do sort of a high-level overview of it. And then in subsequent webinars, we'll be getting into more detailed issues. We have a series of webinars coming up. If we can go to the next slide. Oh, I'll get to that in a minute. We have a series of webinars coming up. Thank you. On things specific to the new legislation. This is our initial series. As we go on over time, I expect we will do additional series of webinars in the future, focusing on things. We'll do this initial series, learn from this. We'll be interested in people's feedback on what works and what doesn't, and we want to sort of continue this sort of theme of having regular webinars on topical areas. You can go back one slide, please. Great. So one thing I do want to sort of frame is sort of, it's important to talk about what we're going to be talking about today, but also step back and discuss a little bit about what we're not going to talk about. This is intended to be an educational webinar, and in that sense, this is different from stakeholder feedback sessions that the IPA has historically held and will continue to hold in the future. So this is an opportunity for us to educate, not an opportunity for feedback. We actually have a feedback session coming up next week specific to the adjustable block program and its opening. So there will be opportunities for feedback sessions, but again, it's going to be different from these Power Hour webinars that have a more focused goal to them. We also are not going to focus on specific programs or procurement requirements. Again, not getting into the detailed nuts and bolts of those. And we're not going to look into things that are sort of outside of the purview of the IPA. So CEJA was a wide-ranging bill covering lots and lots of issues that are of great importance to everyone. But we're going to focus on things that connect to what the Illinois Power Agency does. We're not going to get into grants from the Department of Commerce Economic Opportunity, clean workforce hubs, changes to rate making and ethics provisions, some of these other things listed here. Those I know there's a lot of other organizations doing educational material workshops as well. They'll have those opportunities. But for the IPA, we want to focus on the things really core to the work that we do. So if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is the series of, okay, well, we'll continue here. So I just want to step back for a moment and for those of you who don't know the Illinois Power Agency, just sort of put into context who we are and what our role is in the renewable energy sector in Illinois. We're an independent state agency that was created back in 2007, coming out of some controversies across 2006 and 2007 over how electricity was procured for what are known as default service customers. These are the customers who choose not to switch their electric suppliers. The agency was created to oversee their procurements and initially had a small renewables role, but what's been interesting over time is that our work on renewables has expanded to really be the bulk of the agency's work. But just to put things into context, we're an independent state agency really designed to sort of be objective and independent as we put together how to best implement procurements for various energy related resources to serve the needs of residents and businesses of Illinois. So specifically, every year we put together a procurement plan for electricity supply for default service customers. Again, these are the customers of ComEd, Ameren, and Mid-American who choose not to switch to a different supplier. We also develop and implement other specific procurement plans. Examples of these would be the zero emissions credit procurement plan of several years ago, or as part of CEJA, carbon mitigation credit procurement plan that's in the process of being approved right now. This is part of sort of a range of things that the General Assembly over the years has asked the agency to do sort of on specific focused issues. Going back a few years, the agency had a lot of involvement in a number of clean coal related initiatives. The time has passed for those, but we're set up to really go in and where there are specific issues within the energy industry of the state where the sort of independence of the agency and our ability to run procurements can be valuable, we're able to come in and do that as requested by the General Assembly. We also, and of what's of interest today, is that we have a key role in the implementation of the Renewable Portfolio Standard. We develop what's known as the long-term renewable resources procurement plan that guides our activities around renewable energy. And then flowing from that, we conduct competitive procurements for utility scale projects and then manage programs for community solar and solar for homes and businesses. The two programs there, the adjustable block program and solar for all. We'll get into some details of those a little bit later. So this is sort of a high level overview of what the agency does. Next slide. Now we'll turn to some background on how we got to Public Act 102-0662, and I will turn it over to Brian Granahan for that.
Thanks, Anthony. This is Brian Granahan. I'm the Chief Legal Counsel from the Illinois Power Agency. I also serve as our legislative liaison. So for a lot of people, I think what we're going to be talking about here is known and understood. So if you were involved in the development of this bill or a proponent in favor of one of the legislative proposals that were put forward in the last few years, you're already aware of all of this, but there may be people on this webinar who are not. I think we have now up to 230 participants. So this is probably good background for people who saw the bill pass, but may not understand what the ingredients were that led to it being passing. And on this slide, we just have an overview of some of the various ingredients that came together to provide the right formula for legislative action to really reshape not only the Renewable Portfolio Standard, but really the state policy approach to clean energy more generally. One of those was a need to support nuclear plants at risk of closure. Anthony mentioned the carbon mitigation credit procurement process that came out of that. There's a very strong desire for more equitable outcomes from the clean energy economy. We saw proposals like the Clean Energy Jobs Act that really had that as a focus. A need for additional funding, as well as changes to the budget approach used to support new renewable energy projects, and specifically the RPS more generally, and some of the funding concerns that came from the inability to roll over funds from future years and not have those, or to future years and not have those funds available. Obviously, a focus on ethics and rate making reform. We heard the need for stronger labor standards on new projects and prevailing wage requirements and project labor requirements in some cases. And then as coal plants close, there are real questions about what happened within those communities and whether those sites could be used as assets that could be maybe leveraged as part of the transition to clean energy. So as we go to the next slide, with the RPS in particular, there were certain specific issues that really fed their way into the need for legislation. The Future Energy Jobs Act, in certain respects, was a massive success. We've incented the development of over 25,000 new renewable energy projects in Illinois between all of the IPA's different programs and competitive procurements. Just for a sense of scale, we previously had, as of about 2016, about 80 megawatts of installed solar total in Illinois. We're now over 2,000 megawatts of installed solar. So that's a huge change and a great success. over 670 megawatts of that is distributed generation. So that's rooftop solar behind a customer's meter, or community solar, where a customer takes a subscription to the project. And then over 2,300 megawatts of new utility scale wind and utility scale solar. Those are large scale projects that don't exist to offset the load of any given customer, but may sell their energy in wholesale markets. Nevertheless, we were still well behind the percentage-based targets of the RPS. So under FiveYear, those were 25% by 2025. You often heard that talked about in the media and in other places. And we were still only at around 7 or 8%, even with all of that growth and development. And in getting to that 7 or 8%, we largely exhausted available funding, in part to try to meet the targets that were set for new build within the law by 2020, but also because of the contract payment structure, where those supporting those projects carried payment obligations into future years and ate into the budget of those future years, and then the inability to roll over funds that were collected in certain prior years and use them to pay down expenses in future years. There was also a really strong sense that some of the benefits weren't being spread equitably across the clean energy economy. So we needed to start to take corrective steps to make sure that there's something that could be done here to show that the growth of the clean energy economy matched the vision that might have been expressed by advocates. So as we go to the next slide, there were a number of bills introduced across 2019 and 2021. This is just a sampling of them. I know I've left some of them out. I think I probably just pulled some of the bills that were introduced most recently, and that's what these House bill and Senate bill numbers reflect. So obviously with the Clean Energy Jobs Act, with the Clean Jobs Coalition, Downstate Energy Affordability Act, Path 100 Act, all of these different proposals ultimately have elements of them that are reflected in the final bill that was chosen. But each of these was taken, put before the General Assembly, evaluated, may have had committee hearings on it, and ultimately some of these ideas then, when there were composite bills produced, were pulled from the bills that were introduced by various advocates. So as we moved across a period where these bills were put before the General Assembly, as we go to the next slide, eventually we landed in a place after about a 2.5-year process where all of those different bills and concepts ended up becoming manifest into some sort of composite bill. And just to give you some sense of what that process looked like, there were ongoing workshops, working groups, especially during this past legislative session, committee hearings, various bill drafts being traded back and forth, negotiations, comment processes, and then much of this was interrupted by a global health pandemic across 2020 and 2021 that made it very difficult to try to make progress on legislative initiatives when more pressing concerns might have taken precedent and the legislature wasn't regularly meeting in person. By late 2021, we started to see drafts of a bill that borrowed ideas from each of these bills. Unfortunately, it wasn't able to be passed at the end of session by May 31st, 2021, but eventually we reached a breaking point in the late summer, where RPS issues continue to be a major concern with the inability to support additional renewable project development. And then we had nuclear plants moving toward closure, and eventually a composite bill was produced that could pass both the House and the Senate with the supermajorities needed, given that it was passed the May 31st date. So as we go to the next slide, that then came together in what's now Public Act 1020662. Again, it represents a number of parties' visions and ideas across all different constituencies, put into a pretty heavily negotiated bill. And as Anthony had mentioned, this is a gigantic bill touching on a number of different areas. We're just concerning ourselves with those areas that the IPA is tasked with implementing through this series. That's maybe, I don't know, 300 or 400 pages out of a 950-page bill. But we thought we'd try to provide an educational overview on those pieces that fall to the IPA for implementation. As Anthony mentioned, this isn't our stakeholder feedback process. This is more just an educational overview on individual topics, with this particular session being about the RPS generally, probably being the most general of each of those. One of those topics is the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS. So I will turn it back over to Anthony to talk a little bit of background on what the RPS is and what the Illinois RPS in particular does.
Great, thank you, Brian. So let's step back for a second and ask a question. What is a renewable portfolio standard? Why are we talking about this? We live and breathe this every day, so we take it for granted, but I wanted to make sure, just sort of, for those of you a little less familiar with the details of this, sort of a little bit of perspective. So I think the starting point is the question that if you have a desire to achieve clean energy goals, how should you go about doing it? And there's a variety of ways it can be done. But to sort of put it roughly into two camps, you can really take a regulatory approach where you really, through a regulatory commission or maybe even through specific legislation, instruct that certain new types of generation gets built. This is what's typically known as integrated resource planning, where you really sort of decide what do you need to serve the energy needs of an area, and then you make a plan on how to build it. This was done traditionally with conventional power types of power plants, but it can also be done through renewables, and this is the way many of our neighboring states approach things. A market-based approach creates incentives for renewable energy standards through having a compliance requirement for utilities that serve end use customers. And this is what a Renewable Portfolio Standard in essence is. It's a requirement for a utility to have a portion of their energy come from renewable energy sources. What makes this all very complicated is that RPSs vary by state, and roughly half of the states in the country have it. The most recent statistic I saw was somewhere between 50 and 60% of the energy use in the United States is in states where there is an RPS. But each state does it a little bit differently. So if you're working at the national level on this, you can't just simply say this is an RPS and it's all the same. Each state has its own particular quirks and nuances. Those often are driven by specific policy goals that a given state may need, and may be driven also by where a state is and what sort of resources they have. So what they choose to include in their RPS may vary. But some general observations about RPS, about the various RPSs. One is that they tend to have increasing annual goals. And Brian mentioned earlier the 25% by 2025 was what was embedded into the Illinois RPS when it was first enacted and modified a few times now. Again, more recently modified with some goals that go out a little bit further. But those typically have a model where there's a percentage set and then it ratchets up each year, year by year, to get to a certain baseline or an end result. Another key thing, and this is very important in terms of thinking big picture about what we're trying to achieve on clean energy, is that RPSs are measured based upon a percentage of the electricity consumed in the state rather than the generation located in the state. And this is significant because it's two different ways of looking at things. So you can look up how much energy is produced by power plants in Illinois. That will give you one number. You can also look up how much electricity is used by consumers in Illinois, and that is a different number. Illinois is a net exporter of electricity. Other states are net importers. So depending on where you are, and you're thinking about what an RPS would look like, that generation mix versus the consumption in the state are going to vary. So again, we're looking at what are we doing to serve the load or consumption in the state through an RPS rather than necessarily focusing on the specific generation resources. Another feature of a lot of RPSs is that they have compliance payments that need to be made. We used to have those in Illinois, and in some cases, penalties. So if a utility doesn't meet an RPS goal, there's certain payments they need to make, often called alternative compliance payments. We do not have those as part of the Illinois RPS. We used to have something called alternative compliance payments, but it was a completely different mechanism compared to what some other states have. Another key feature is that RPSs typically do not cover voluntary markets. In other words, if a large corporation decides that they have a renewable energy goal and they want to go out and procure renewable energy to meet those goals, that is typically not part of an RPS. This is actually a really interesting thing because our changes that come about through CEJA actually has some opportunities for what's known as SelfDirect Program for larger customers, and that's factored into our RPS in an interesting new manner. So that is something that the fact that there is a whole world of renewable energy development going on out there that's not necessarily part of state mandated renewable portfolio standards is something that the law, I think, has taken into account and can give us some new ways to look at that. Next slide. So the reason the RPS model works well in Illinois really comes down to that we're a restructured electricity market where we have separated out the ownership of generation from the traditional electric distribution utilities. And so that's a command and control model of an integrated resource planning where you're telling a utility what type of power plants to build doesn't work in a competitive market where we have generation decisions made by the market. The original version of the RPS that was enacted in 2007 was a great start for the state, but it had some structural issues because of the fact that we're a retail choice state, which I just said was one of the positives. The way it also had an unintended consequence of how funds were collected, where if customers switched between suppliers or switched from being on default service where the utility was providing their electricity to an alternative supplier, this created year-to-year budgeting uncertainty, and that made it difficult, even impossible at times, for the IPA to do procurements to incent the development of new renewables. So the Future Energy Jobs Act that was passed in 2017 included significant improvements. Brian already cited some of the numbers of what's been procured to date, and that includes both things that are actually up and running as well as on the utility scale side. There's still quite a bit of large scale solar that is still under development. But again, really significant numbers that changed the scale of renewables in the state. But we ran into some structural issues related to how money is collected and dispersed. Brian hinted at those a little bit earlier. I'll get into that a little bit as well. And that was all really exacerbated by project delays resulting from COVID-19, where the assumptions about when funds that were collected were going to be spent just got thrown out the window because of project delays. The good news is that the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act addresses these issues. It significantly expands the RPS, both in terms of the quantitative goals, the much higher targets for the state over a longer period of time, as well as it improves the vision of the RPS by thinking more about what do we want the renewable energy industry to look like. So thinking about issues around diversity and equity, bringing in labor standards. This is really a change so that so it's not just about numbers anymore. It's about what do we want the clean energy economy of the state to be in the future. Next slide. So to continue sort of on some of this sort of baseline concepts that we're talking about, one of the most important ones is the concept of a renewable energy credit. A renewable energy credit is really the currency of the RPS in Illinois and in many other states as well. It is what we use to measure renewable energy. It's what we use to measure progress and achievement for meeting the RPS. And the way we have things structured in Illinois is that the Illinois RPS is based upon the idea that the IPA runs programs and procurements for renewable energy credits with our utilities as the buyer of those renewable energy credits, and then they retire them, which is the way you take them off the market to capture the value. So we have a decision making process where the IPA is sort of running these programs, but the utilities are the ones who ultimately the numbers are being measured against. So what is a renewable energy credit? In essence, it is the environmental attributes associated with each megawatt hour of generation from a renewable energy resource. And the idea that when renewable energy credits were developed was that these could be bought and sold and traded separately from the actual electricity. So the idea that the electric grid needs to operate on a day-to-day basis. We want to make sure that that operates in an efficient manner, but we also want to recognize the environmental attributes that renewable energy has that other energy forms do not have. So we have a tracking system that works in parallel with the electricity markets, tracking the generation of renewable energy. And then those renewable energy credits can be traded among entities, and whoever holds them then can claim the environmental benefits of those. By monetizing the value of renewable energy credits, developers can have additional financial certainty that electricity markets may not alone be able to provide to them. So that again is what is important about the renewable energy credits. Another thing to note, just as because we're throwing on various numbers at various points, as will others, is that because of this, the way the Illinois RPS is structured, it's all about the procurement of quantities of renewable energy credits. And then rather than looking at the megawatts, so often you will see people talking about, a 50 megawatt, solar farm or a 300 megawatt wind farm. We'll talk about the size of the project in terms of megawatts, which is the maximum amount of electricity they can produce at a time. We're really measuring everything based upon renewable energy credits produced, which is the electricity produced over time. As Brian mentioned, we had a lot of value from the Future Energy Jobs Act. So we have roughly 1 million renewable energy credits a year coming in now from photovoltaic distributed generation and community solar. Some of that includes community solar projects that are still in the process of being completed. But 2.4 million RECs coming from new utility scale solar projects. Many of those have come online, some of them just even in recent weeks. A few of those are still under development and should be coming online over the next year or so. 2 million renewable energy credits coming from new utility scale wind projects. And we also have 1.8 million RECs that came from the one long-term procurement the IPA was able to do under previous statutory regimes, the long-term power purchase agreements that were conducted back in 2010. Those are almost all wind. There's a few small solar projects. If you go back to 2010, that was really before the radical transformation happened in the solar industry, causing costs to drop and making it economically viable. So if you go back to 2010 and we're thinking about renewables, you were largely thinking about wind. Obviously, today is a very different situation where we're seeing a very different generation mix coming along. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the high-level changes in the RPS, and then Brian will come after me and sort of go into some more detail, and then obviously we'll continue to go in more detail in future webinars. So in terms of the RPS, I'd say some of the key changes is, first of all, the goals changed and our targets changed. The funding situation was addressed both in terms of increasing the funding available, but then also fixing some structural aspects of how the funding worked. We have expansions of our procurements of renewable energy credits from new utility scale wind and solar, some increased goals, and then also some structural changes to those procurements that should lower the risks of project development and make those projects viable. We have expansion to the adjustable block program, which is for distributed generation, which is solar for homes or businesses, as well as what's known as community solar, where you can subscribe to a portion of a solar project. That expansion is both in terms of increasing the number of some categories within that program, as well as adding new requirements in it, but also thanks to the fixing some of the funding issues, the ability to expand that program significantly to allow new projects to come in. The Solar for All program, which supports low-income households and communities, has its funding increased. We're still working through structural improvements to that program, but this will also help expand that program and increase the opportunities. And then cutting across all of the program, all of the RPS, is a new focus on equity. And this includes both more transparency and data reporting. We'll be collecting a lot more data so we can understand better who is in the industry and participating and benefiting from it. And then also the creation of additional participation opportunities for individual and businesses, both as recipients of solar projects, as well as being businesses involved in the development of projects. Hand in hand with what's contained within the RPS that the IPA does, there were a number of other things in CEJA administered by other portions of the state that also will help support those efforts. Next slide, please. So in terms of the goals of the RPS, the 25% by 2025% is still there, although now, previous to CEJA, that was sort of a plateau that we were striving to get. Now we have some catching up to do, but now we're given additional goals going forward of going to 40% by 2030, and then to strive to get up to 50% by 2040. In terms of a perspective, I want to also again reiterate that these goals are about the procurement of RECs rather than saying anything about a specific generation mix within the state. As sort of a order of magnitude, Illinois customer load is about 120 million megawatt hours annually. So 25% of that, we're talking about 30 million megawatts or 30 million RECs. So if you think back a few slides where I was talking about quantities, a few million here, a few million there, we're really talking about very significant expansions in our goals. And that's why I think there's a lot of excitement about the ramping up of the industry in the state to meet these goals. Some specific targets we have is a goal to get to 45 million RECs annually by 2030 from new wind or solar, with a split in there between 45% from new wind and 55% from solar, with half of that coming from the adjustable block program. So a very large portion coming from smaller projects and from community solar projects, and the remainder from utility scale, and then a increased carve out for solar at brownfield sites. So again, very ambitious targets that will be ramping up procurements and programs over the next few months and years to meet. Next slide. To make this all possible, the RPS budget has been revamped. And there's two ways in which this has been done. First, the rate cap, this is the amount that customers are charged, has been increased. And then the baseline against which that's measured has also been changed. So this will increase the funding from roughly $230 to $235 million a year up to somewhere maybe as much as $590 million in annual collections. We're still gathering the data and coming up with, finalizing our estimates of what those numbers are. And those will change year to year because it's based upon a per kilowatt hour charge on customers' bills. So as energy use rises and falls, that number will change over time. Energy efficiency programs, for example, should help decrease consumption in the state. On the other hand, electric vehicle usage may increase it. So long-term, we'll have to obviously be watching how usage in the state impacts the budget. We also have a ramp up of the utility funding contribution that goes into the Solar for All program. This is the program that supports low-income solar. That's going to ramp up from about $11 million a year that the utilities put into that program to about $50 million. So again, another aspect of our commitment, of the commitment within the law to increasing diversity in the solar industry. In addition to that is a fundamental change in how funds are accounted for. The structure set up in the Future Energy Jobs Act, funds collected from 2017 to 2021 were all sort of fungible, and they could be used year to year. But as many of you know, that ended in May of this year, where any money that was not spent was due to be refunded to customers. So, people talked about the solar funding cliff. This was the idea that money was accumulating, was available to be spent, but then there was a sharp cutoff where that all went away, and then we suddenly were faced with annual budgets. And the problem that was that didn't correlate to the reality of when we made decisions about projects having contracts and funding and the varying timeframes it takes to develop projects, because the funding doesn't start getting paid out to a project until it's built. So if you don't know when it's going to come online, you don't know when you're going to start spending money. That was going to be tight before COVID. COVID changed everything because at that moment, development stopped for a lot of projects for a very long time, and our assumptions about when money was going to be going out the door got thrown out the window. The graph you can see here is one of several we developed over the last year. This was the one from August that shows how the shift in funding got to the point where once we went to the annual budgets, we were potentially facing an issue where the money to be spent in a year was going to exceed the collections available in the year. So this sort of cash-based accounting system didn't work in the reality of how project development and energization works. So one of the key things, next slide, please, is to change that. And so CEJA does this in a couple ways. First, we now have a 5-year spending window. And the idea here is that funds are collected, any funds collected in a given year can be spent anytime over the next 5 years in sort of a first in, first out basis. Basically, the idea is that you spend the oldest money first before you get to the next year's funds, and in fact have a vintage. So I've been sort of working on how to best sort of visualize this to sort of give an illustrative example. And I think this graph does an okay job of that, in that if you look at it, for example, you see in the third year of this graph, there's the funds collected that year are in yellow. Those don't get spent the next year until all the gray money gets spent. Once the gray money, which came from the second year, is all spent, then you start spending the yellow money, and then when that's all spent, you then start spending the blue money, so that you basically have flexibility and more time. It's not this cliff that we faced earlier this year, where suddenly in May of 2021, anything from the previous 4 years was subject to a refund to customers. Now this is done graduated over time, focusing on when the funds came in. Another significant change is that if there are going to be refunds, that those are adjusted for any contractual commitments that have been made but not yet paid for. So again, that would accommodate the idea that if there are things that force projects to take longer to be developed than expected, we don't start taking away the money that was planned for spending that. We account for the fact that and the reality of the world that delays happen and create some additional flexibility. So this gives us both increased spending power and increased flexibility. And those to me are key in terms of what will make CEJA work better in terms of creating the funding certainty we need for the expansion of the programs and procurements. Next slide. With this, I'll now turn it back to Brian to go into some of the RPS specifics.
Thank you, Anthony. And I think one of the ways that's helpful to think about this is how is all of this funding being spent? So Anthony referenced the changes in the amount that's being collected, the flexibility around how we can use it year over year, but then how is it actually leveraged to support additional renewable energy project development? And we tend to think of this as a couple of ways. One is through programs such as the Adjustable Block Program, and another is through competitive procurement processes. I'll talk a little bit about some of the structural changes to the Adjustable Block Program through this slide, and then obviously we have next week a dedicated session on the Adjustable Block Program and some of the changes to the program from CEJA. The Adjustable Block Program is used to support distributed generation projects and community solar projects through renewable energy credit delivery contracts. So the price for renewable energy credits times the amount of renewable energy credits scheduled to be delivered under that contract provides the incentive back to the project developer, and in many cases the customer or host, for putting that project online. Previously, under the Adjustable Block Program, you basically had a certain amount of capacity, a certain number of megawatts of projects that subscribed to a particular category, and then when that was filled, you stepped down in price to reduce incentive. Under changes in CEJA, we are now moving to an annual block structure where those step downs take place annually. And basically you have a bucket that fills in across the course of a year. And once that's full, you wait until the next year before the bucket reopens. Previously, we had three categories in the Adjustable Block Program: small distributed generation, large distributed generation, and community solar, with small distributed generation being projects up to 10 kilowatts in size, and large distributed generation being projects up to 2 megawatts in size. Now we're moving to 6 categories and more targeted categories at that, with changes to the size thresholds for small DG, large DG, community solar. We also have targeted programs for public schools, or targeted category at least for public schools, and community-driven community solar, and then a block that's specific to equity-eligible contractors for 10% of the overall program value, potentially being adjusted up to 40% over time. REC prices are still administratively set. There's still a transparent schedule of prices based on the model the IPA will produce and attach to its long-term renewable resource procurement plan. There's a number of new equity and prevailing wage requirements. We have a slide on this as part of this presentation, but we'll be talking about these also at a later session. The contract length and payout terms change by project category from what we had previously. This is also something that we'll be discussing next week. It's something that's a little bit more nuanced, and we'll have to spend some time going through it. And then additionally, there's a memorialization of a lot of aspects of consumer protection that previously the IPA had handled through its long-term renewable resource procurement plan and through consumer protection guidelines that it published thereafter. Now much of this is memorialized in state law and will be attached to our long-term plan. And that's also something that we can talk about in more detail at next week's changes to the Adjustable Block Program session. So as we go to the next slide, in addition to some of these structural changes that we'll be handling largely through the development of our long-term renewable resource procurement plan, which is due to be published 120 days after the effective date of the act. Then we have 45 days for comments, 21 days to revise it, and then that's put before the Illinois Commerce Commission for a 120-day approval proceeding. That's 306 days total. So that means that if we waited until that plan was approved, it would be a long time before blocks reopen and additional market activity was being supported. As a consequence, changes found within Public Act 102-0662 also call for block reopenings within 90 days of the effective date of the act. And the sizes of those blocks are part of this slide. We have 75 megawatts for both large DG and small DG. Community solar is taken exclusively from the ordinal wait lists, and there's 250 megawatts that's intended to represent 2 years worth of capacity for that category. The same is true with community-driven community solar with the 2 year of capacity for that block. Then 50 megawatts for the new public schools category and 75 megawatts for the equity eligible contractor block. As this is something that's on a very tight timetable, we have to reopen these blocks by mid-December essentially. We're already in the process of seeking stakeholder feedback on some of the nuances associated with block reopenings. So we published some documents, I think just yesterday, seeking feedback on a number of different topic areas. And then ultimately we'll have webinars on October 21st that gets into some of the issues specific to block reopening. Ultimately, those are the places to discuss some of the questions about how we're handling block reopening. This series is just more of an educational webinar about what's in the law. So as we go to the next slide, competitive procurement changes. So we utilize a competitive procurement model for supporting utility scale wind projects, utility scale solar projects, and brownfield site solar projects. Competitive procurements means that bidders offer bids into a process that's managed by our procurement administrator, subject to certain requirements in section 16.111.5 of the Public Utilities Act. And then bids that qualify are selected on the basis of price generally, although there are some changes found in CEJA that also have us take equity considerations or places where certain grants are being received into account and trying to fold that into the bid evaluation process. This again isn't really the forum where we talk about some of the nuances associated with that. We just wanted to flag that this is an aspect of the law. Prior to the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, bidders bid in a fixed REC price. And what that meant was over the course of, say, a 15-year REC delivery contract, they were being paid a certain price per REC with each delivery year. Maybe that's $5, maybe that's $10, maybe that's $20. Whatever it is, the amount of incentive that that project received was that REC price times the quantity of RECs delivered under the contract. Through the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, we have a different model in place that utilizes a floating REC price. This is very similar for maybe some of the folks who develop out of state to what we understand to be done by NYSERDA, for instance, in New York. And bidders bid in a REC price, but that REC price then changes year over year based on energy revenues and based on a forward energy curve. So if energy prices are particularly high, there's an assumption that the bidder is receiving more revenues from the energy markets, and as a consequence, the REC price would decline. Conversely, if energy prices are low, the REC price would be higher by virtue of the fact that the overall price would need to be made up through a higher incentive. Again, we also have to fold in part, some equity considerations in the bid evaluations, because again, it will take some time for our long-term renewable resource procurement plan to be published and approved by the ICC. There are subsequent forward procurements called for within 240 days of the effective date of the act. So there will again be some opportunities for projects to participate before the time that we have our long-term plan approved. And there's also new requirements regarding project labor agreements applicable to utility scale wind, utility scale solar, and brownfield site solar projects. Going on to the next slide. So there's also a host of new labor diversity and equity requirements. And I'll just provide a brief overview here, as again, we have a dedicated session on this, and especially with respect to diversity and equity, there are so many items to work through, and it's of such elevated importance that we want to make this its own session. For labor requirements, a few of the new requirements are first, prevailing wage requirements that are applicable to certain project type for construction activity on the development of that project. Those are found now in 1-75C1Q, 1 of the IPA Act, that applies to certain adjustable block program categories, but applies exemptions from the prevailing wage requirements for residential projects and houses of worship. In looking at these for block reopenings, we have some questions about this. So this is part of our ongoing stakeholder feedback process in our meeting next week. And then again, project labor agreements required for utility scale projects as well. Diversity and equity requirements run through all of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, not just those aspects of the bill that are really about the IPA's implementation of the RPS or the other things that we do. We have this new equity eligible contractor block that's applicable to program applicants. Again, we have a 75 megawatt set aside as part of block reopening for that new block. Additionally, we have new equity eligible workforce requirements found in the law as well. That's applicable to the workforce used in participating projects. And those are items that will actually be fleshed out in much more detail in our long-term plan. And then this last bullet point, there's a catch-all of just so many different things that we're doing and really getting our heads wrapped around right now and will be addressed at a future session, such as data collection, which Anthony referenced earlier, the development of a workforce database, conducting a disparity study that could give us cover to make more targeted changes to our programs, certification processes for equity eligible contractors and equity eligible workforce participants, annual reporting required by firms. This, again, will all address this at a future date. So as we go on to the next slide, adjacent state project participation, I wanted to highlight really quickly because it occurs to me that given the breadth of participants we have on this webinar, not everyone may be familiar with the requirements that currently exist regarding participation under the Illinois RPS for projects in adjacent states. Now, this is only an issue for our competitive procurement processes for the utility scale projects, and it's mostly unchanged through Public Act 102-0662. What this approach requires the IPA to do is basically take some public interest criteria found in the law, reduce those down then to a quantitative scoring requirement, and then make a determination about whether a project in that adjacent state scores high enough under that scoring requirement to be considered eligible for the Illinois RPS. That scoring system is described in our long-term renewable resource procurement plan, those that have been published previously. And what we can do from that scoring process is actually create concentric circles into adjacent states. So a project developer will know, based on where that project is located geographically, whether it would qualify for the Illinois RPS. Now, Public Act 102-0662 does contain a bit of an exception to this for HVDC converter stations located in Illinois. In that case, projects that ultimately transmit their energy over a qualifying HVDC lines and then to an HVDC converter station located in Illinois that meets various statutory criteria, that energy is then considered in-state for purposes of this adjacent state and in-state requirement. So as we go to the next slide. One last issue I want to highlight here as well, as it doesn't quite fit in as well with some of our future presentations, is the new RPS SelfDirect Program. This, Anthony had mentioned earlier, provides an opt-out from certain RPS charges for large customers who meet at least 40% of their load through RECs from qualifying renewable energy projects. Now, what do we mean by certain RPS charges? Well, certain RPS charges are the utility scale portion of RPS charges as we define it through our long-term renewable resource procurement plan. So our plan will basically, and I think we have to publish this as an annual basis, say this is the utility scale portion for new utility scale projects that you're exempted from by virtue of having qualifying self-direct procurement of RECs. Qualifying customers have a high peak demand requirement, but at the same time, they can include multiple retail accounts that have the same corporate parent. So the most obvious example of this would probably be a chain, for instance, if they have the same corporate parent, like a Walgreens or CVS or anyone else, they can then couple those accounts together. Qualifying projects are new wind or solar projects. And this is really important because I think one of the issues with self-direct programs can be, does that satisfy the but-for requirement? Does it satisfy the requirement that but for this benefit of opting out or having a self-direct, a new project would not be built? And if that's not the case, then maybe you're not achieving the same overall objectives through allowing this sort of a self-direct program. But here, qualifying projects are new wind and solar projects. They have to meet the same RPS geographic requirements as we have to employ under our plan, and the contracts have to be long-term in length. The overall size of this self-direct program is determined through our long-term plan, although I believe we have to look at external studies in making an evaluation of that size. And then that will ultimately allow us to back out those retail sales hours from self-direct participants when it comes to calculating our overall project or overall progress toward the RPS. So this is an entirely new aspect of the Illinois RPS that hadn't been part of it before. So we go to the next slide. Also, I want to highlight a few changes to the Illinois Solar for All program. Anthony, I think, hit the biggest of these. We're up to a $50 million annual utility collection budget versus what had previously been $10 or $11 million. That can be averaged over a 3-year period for the first 3 years to make sure it's $50 million on average. Also, a few sub-program changes, including the elimination of the Community Solar Pilot Program and the addition of a multifamily building program. There is an increased focus on small emerging businesses that's found through the law and new energy sovereignty requirements. We'll be covering all of this in an Illinois Solar for All specific webinar on Friday, November 12th.
Thank you, Brian. I think now we are going to take some questions. Looks like we've gotten some questions. So first question is, let's see here. Can you provide some data on MW and ABP that have reached COD? The ABP website doesn't seem to include this data in their capacity dashboard.
Sure, I'd be happy to address that. One place you can find that information is in the now withdrawn draft long-term plan we had issued in August. Brian had talked about how we are in the process of updating the long-term plan to release a new version in January. We had published a draft plan in August before CEJA passed based upon the requirements of the previous law, and then withdrew that with CEJA passing because we now need to revamp it. In that plan, there is a table, table 6.6, that goes through those numbers. So I don't have the numbers as of today, but as of August, just a way of example, 145 megawatts of small DG had been energized, 227 of large distributed generation, and 64 megawatts of community solar. I know a number of community solar projects have come online since then, so that number is growing. So we're at a point where a pretty large portion of the small DG and large DG from the initial blocks has been energized, and the community solar is now finally beginning to catch up as projects have been able to move forward. But still, we're, I think less than half of the original set of community solar projects have been energized, but I imagine that we'll see that number really pick up in the spring.
Anthony, I think our project application reports are updated as well. And when projects are energized, they shift between one report and the next. Is that right?
Yeah, so they're on the Adjustable Block Program website. There are reports of projects. That isn't aggregated data, so you'd have to do a little bit of work, downloading the spreadsheet and summing up the numbers, but those would be more up-to-date numbers. But in general, I think the message I would offer is that of the original blocks of the Adjustable Block Program for distributed generation, we're really in the tail end of projects being coming online, and community solar is obviously lagging a little bit behind that.
Thank you, Anthony. Thanks, Brian. Another question that we've gotten in the chat, it says, is there a resource that outlines specific dates and volumes, the term tenure of REC contracts, and how the IPA procurement process will be run now? Or will this only be available when the long-term procurement plan is published? When is this now expected to be done?
So I assume this question is related to utility scale projects. And in that, there is a utility scale wind and solar procurement that we have to conduct 240 days from when the act took effect, which is in the spring of next year. We expect probably fairly soon to be releasing some information about details of the timeline for that procurement. And it will incorporate in the indexed REC model, price model that Brian discussed. But otherwise, largely that competitive procurement, other aspects of it will look like historical procurements. And then in the long-term plan, we will be fleshing out details for subsequent procurements that come after that. So we have one procurement that comes out before the new long-term plan, and then the long-term plan will set a schedule going forward after that.
Thank you. Another question we've gotten is, are prevailing wage requirements applicable to solar installations at small businesses of 10 kW or less, or 25 kW size or less?
So these sorts of interpretive questions, I would say, save for the webinar next week on block reopening. And then to the extent they're not about block reopening, we can handle them through our long-term renewable resource procurement plan in that process. This is purely an educational overview webinar. So I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on that, because understand there's some challenges in reading some of those provisions.
Sure. I think some of the questions are very technical, and like you mentioned, Brian, I think they can be addressed at later webinars in the future. The one particular question I do want to address is, can community solar be allowed in muni co-ops?
So Anthony, this is, I mean, I saw this question in the chat, and I think what we had previously required was that community solar was allowable in the service territories of rural electric cooperatives and municipal utilities if the net metering requirements mirrored that, which were available to customers in electric distribution utility service territories.
That's correct. And in fact, there is one community solar project in, I believe, I want to say Joe Carroll, co-op.
And I think the challenge here is that this was an approach that we proposed and had approved through our last long-term plan. Don't believe there's any issue here regarding the law having prohibited expressly any development of community solar projects in muni and rural co-op service territories. But I think it does raise the issue of, during our next long-term plan litigation, some of the issues of what requirements will apply could be things that are raised. And so we don't know what the outcome of that will be.
Great. I think those were the questions that could be addressed at this meeting. Well, I think one question did actually come up. I want to address this. What is the future of net metering?
That would fall into the category of things that are sort of outside of the IPA's purview. There are changes in CEJA to net metering that are pretty significant. But again, those are run through utility tariffs approved by the Illinois Commerce Commission. So on this sort of theme that Brian had mentioned earlier, in terms of this being an educational workshop related to IPA activities, we'd rather not delve into the details there. I'm sure other organizations will be doing a lot of educational efforts around those significant changes.
Thank you. I think those were the questions that came in the chat window that are pretty general for this webinar, and I think you've answered all of those, so thank you both. I think with that, I think we should be good to go. I think once this webinar is completed, we will provide a recording on our IPA website. And the next IPA Power Hour session, which is Impact of CEJA on the Adjustable Block Program, will be held on Friday, October 22nd from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. If you haven't registered for the webinar yet, you can do so by going to the IPA website and clicking Events link at the footer of the IPA website. So I think with that, on behalf of the Illinois Power Agency, I want to thank you all for joining the IPA Power Hour webinar. We will see you next week. Thank you.